right, we are in 2 John. 2 John, just one chapter. We started introducing and moving into some of the things about the letter last week, and then we'll try and progress through. Let's begin by reading it once again, just 13 verses. This is the ESV rendering. The elder to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth, because of the truth that abides in us and will be with us forever. Grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ the Father's Son in truth and love. I rejoice greatly to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as we were commanded by the Father. And now I ask you, dear lady, not as though I were writing you a new commandment, but the one that we had from the beginning, that we love one another. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. And this is the commandment, just as you have heard from the beginning, so that you should walk in it. For many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Such a one is the deceiver and the antichrist. Watch yourselves so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win a full reward. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house, nor give him any greeting, for whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works. Though I have much to write to you, I would rather not use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to come to you and talk face to face, so that our joy may be complete. The children of your elect sister greet you. All right. So last week, we did some introductory, as we said, just remind ourselves of a few things. The Apostle John, it seems, there doesn't seem to be any reason to believe anyone other than him wrote it. Whereas the first letter is more anonymous in the sense that if you look in the text itself, you'd have no reference to John. But the Gospels are also anonymous in that sense. I'm not saying we can't know who wrote them. I'm saying if you look at the text and you read it and you're looking for him to say, hey, it's me, you're not going to find it. It's anonymous in that sense. But 2 John, there's a little bit more. It would seem that 1 John was kind of the big circular letter that addressed the main issue at hand. And as we mentioned, 2 and 3 John were individual congregation-specific situations, whether that's an appendix put on the back end of the book for some things, or like a cover letter that went on it, however you want to think about it. That's what he's dealing with, are specific congregations. And so he's most likely, again, still in Ephesus. And as we said, we talked about last week the circulation of the letters, and taking those letters and sending them out to individual churches. We're dealing with house churches. How many? It could be a ton. It just depends. And may have been the 7 churches of Asia also receiving this letter that you're thinking about in Revelation 2 and 3. So circulating, most likely beginning in Ephesus, a major city. Probably, again, written in the 90s, so very, very close to the time that the first letter was written. And then it has kind of a twin purpose to encourage them to continue to love each other and to walk according to God's commandments, which is basically a summation of what 1 John was about in the sense of the ethical demands of the letter. Love God, love other people, do what God tells you to do. So it's a short synopsis, and then he deals with a specific situation and gives them an exhortation about how to handle traveling, what are called itinerant preachers. And we'll say more about that when we get to verses 9 through 11. So as we come to the book itself, or the short book itself, the elder to the elect lady, the elder most likely having reference to the fact that John is just an older man. Could he be saying that he is an elder in the sense that he's an elder in the church the way we think about it? Sure, he could be meaning that. 1 Peter 5, you have Peter as an apostle and an elder. But I don't get that sense here. I get it in the sense of the way it's reading to me, in my mind anyway, is something like Philemon, where Paul uses the same word about himself, and he says, I'm now Paul the aged. And so he's just kind of the older, well, I mean, no other apostles are alive. He's kind of the, you might say, older statesman of the church. And so to have that term elder, and of course he refers to them as little children all throughout 1 John. And so that's most likely what it means, at least in my opinion. You're welcome to flesh out and to look at it and to obviously have a different opinion. I'm certainly no authority on it. So then the elder to the elect lady and her children. And we just briefly mentioned, in my judgment, there are about 5 different specific approaches people take to interpreting who is the elect lady. Just briefly, I don't think the elect lady is actually one single lady he's talking to. It could be. I don't think so. And that has to do, when you look at the end of the letter, you remember that the last statement of the letter is, the children of your elect sister greet you. And so it seems to me like the church is many times pictured in the feminine. And let me explain the church is the bride of Christ. That's a feminine image. It's not a masculine image, okay? And so you hear it, I think I mentioned last week, growing up, the phrases that I heard even as a kid were like sister churches. Like that's the way we spoke of other churches. And so it would seem that this is not addressing the church as a whole, otherwise it doesn't make sense to say your elect sister. So if it's the whole church, and then you say, well, who's the elect sister then? Because the whole church should be the elect. I mean, so that one doesn't seem to make much sense. And so to me it seems like we're probably dealing with one specific congregation, particular house church in that particular context. So wherever that church was, no idea. Obviously in Asia Minor. So the elder of the elect and to the elect lady and her children. So talking about a specific congregation, a way of addressing them. And he says, whom I love in truth. Okay? And so when he's talking about in truth, I don't get the sense, there's a way he could have said it had he wanted to say something like, I love you with sincerity. Like truth in the sense of without hypocrisy. That doesn't seem to be the way it's structured. When you look at it, you would expect it to be written a little bit differently. So it seems like what he's saying is whom I love in truth is, think about the emphasis in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and even the Gospel of John on the word truth. And its connection to Jesus and its connection to like the whole Christian system. And so I think what he has reference to when he says the elder to the elect lady and her children whom I love in truth, I think in truth is kind of a prepositional phrase that's the realm in which their love exists, because they have submitted themselves to Jesus. They've submitted themselves to the same truth, and there's a mutual love that exists between them because of it. And if you travel and go to churches in different parts of the world, even different parts of the state, or just where you are a stranger, you don't know anyone, and you feel a sense of peace and security when you walk into those church buildings, and I think that's. I still encourage, I know some people watch, and again, I'm not here to make an argument one way or the other on that. I'm just simply here to say that visiting other churches has tremendous benefit. And walking into the building and actually being in the building with a different group of people that you don't know, and but yet at the same time you do feel connection to. And that's tough to explain. It's something really that's kind of experienced more than it is just really easy to illustrate. But I think that's the sense which John has here. Certainly he loves them, but there is a special love that exists because of truth. And then he goes on to say, and not only I, but also all who know the truth. And so he's kind of drawing this sphere of truth and the people who live in it okay? The individuals, the Christians inside this sphere, and the love that's supposed to exist inside of this sphere of truth, okay? So he's saying, I love you, and then there's this mutual love that exists amongst all of the people of God committed to the truth. And you remember that the truth is not just necessarily sets of ideas. Jesus proclaims himself to be truth. So truth is a being, okay? So then he says this, and this is where we left off, I think. Because of the truth that abides in us and will be with us forever, okay? So the truth that abides in us, if you think about it, I mean, he's going to say it later in this letter, but he's also said it previously in 1 John. There has been this constant discussion of us abiding in God and God abiding in us. And so the truth abiding in us, because of the truth that abides in us, it could be our belief, the belief system of Christianity being in us. It could be a reference to Jesus being in us and the fact that he will be with us forever. Okay? And so he's building an argument, and honestly, it took me, I'm not sure I exactly know how to communicate it perfectly, because there's some strange wording, and trying to get through the nitty-gritty details to parse it out is not the easiest thing in the world. But he's writing to them because of that truth, and he says, because of the truth that abides in us and will be with us forever, then he makes a statement that looks like a familiar way to begin a letter, but yet at the same time it's different if you really press down on it a little bit. So he says, grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ the Father's Son in truth and love. Okay? Grace, mercy, and peace. If you read Paul, that's not an uncommon way for how he would begin a letter. But when Paul uses it, it's almost like a prayer where he's saying, may grace, mercy, and peace be with you, right? That's not the way this is actually stated. This is stated as a fact. Grace, mercy, and peace will be with you. And it has to do with our connection to the truth. And because of our connection to the truth, our connection to Jesus, grace and mercy and peace will be with us from God and from Jesus, the Father's Son. And again, you see that phrase, in truth and love. Our dedication to truth and the love that exists. And so, when we think about these terms, grace, mercy, and peace, sometimes we have a tendency to view them with kind of a restricted view. So a lot of people, when they hear the word grace, and it's not a bad thing that they associate this, I think it's actually a good thing. I just want us to kind of expand it a little bit. But grace is not just, well, when we think of grace, we most often think of God's grace in saving us, right? But every time the word grace is used, that's not necessarily all that is there, okay? For an example, Paul tells Timothy, maybe 2 Timothy 2:1, you therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ. That's just one illustration of several things where grace is not just the thing which saves us, but there's also a sense in which God's grace is sustaining us. God's grace is providing for us as we walk through life, okay? And so grace is not solely associated with us being forgiven of our sins and becoming Christians, but also there's a sense in which grace is empowerment, where God's grace is continually poured into us and empowers us to do certain things. And so when he says grace, mercy, and peace will be with us, certainly there will be forgiveness for Christians. That's in the first letter. That's in the letter that's attached to this one. But also just God's gracious provision for us. When it comes to mercy, there's a sense of, I think the most common definition you would hear if you ask most people what mercy was, it's withholding punishment that is due. And so again, it's kind of an association with grace. Matter of fact, grace and mercy many times are pictured as two sides of the same coin. But mercy also itself has a fuller meaning. Mercy definitely has with it a meaning of understanding and getting into the skin of other people. Okay? For an example, even forgiveness is sometimes spoken of as mercy. In Matthew 18, he's called the unmerciful servant. Well, why? Because he didn't get in the skin of the other person and act accordingly. He had just been forgiven, and he forgot how to trade places with the man who had committed the offense. And so he was unmerciful in that sense. And so mercy is more holistic. And so when he says that God's mercy is with us, it's God's understanding of who we are, our human frailties, are helping us and aiding us in difficulties. And then there's the idea of peace. And peace is, again, a word that we kind of have to expand on a little bit. We need to think about it a little bit more broadly. Most people think peace is the absence of conflict. In a sense, yeah, I think that's right. In another sense, you have to remember that peace, especially in a Christian mindset, is adopting it from like the Old Testament image of peace. And the Old Testament image or word for peace is shalom. And Jewish shalom is the idea of not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of prosperity and wholeness of life. Okay? And so when you put these images together and saying these things are going to be with us, it's not just God forgiving us and saving us, because you have to remember he's writing to people who have already been forgiven and saved. But there's also a sense in which the continuing grace of God and his understanding for us in our circumstances and the wholeness of life that he intends to bring to us, the well-being, which can be peace of mind and soul and a number of different things, that's kind of what's going on. And so he's beginning the letter this way with well wishes, or with actually a statement of fact concerning what God will be for them. All right? So then he mentions in verse 4, he says, "I rejoice greatly to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as we were commanded by the Father." And so what is he saying? Basically, I ran into some of your members. I ran into people who are your children. They're members of that particular congregation. And it's good to see them doing well. I rejoiced greatly in the fact that they were walking. And walking, of course, is a Jewish image of the direction of your life. And so they were walking according to the commandment of the Father. I found people who were members of your local congregation, came across them, and it's great to see that they are faithful. Okay? And if you've ever been associated with multiple churches, you go back to those places, and there are people that you loved dearly and that meant a lot to you, and you never thought there would be a day when you would find their pew empty, and it's empty. And it's a tough pill to swallow. But when you go back and you visit places and you see people who maybe weren't faithful or even were faithful, and yet they're continuing to be faithful and they're continuing to do the right thing, it's a good feeling to see that they're still with it, because you've seen how many people can drop out, how many people can get knocked out. And so it's fun to be able, and it's joyous to be able to go back and to see people still doing well and prospering. And so, part of what may have prompted John, other than the issue at hand that he's going to really address, is he saw them. And, sometimes I will run into people, and I will text one of the elders at a former place and say, hey, I ran into so-and-so today, and it was, good to see them. And there's a sense in this letter of, well, in the first letter too, but there's a sense of community and closeness that churches have. And not just within the walls of their, quote, church buildings, but amongst churches in general. We talk about autonomy, and rightly so. That is, each church self-governs itself. I don't have to tell you, there have been issues of churches thinking it's their job to govern other, and I'm talking about in churches of Christ, unfortunately. They think it's their job to keep every other church around them in line instead of worrying about themselves. But when you have congregations that can respect each other's autonomy and differences in decisions and the way certain things are handled, it's a good thing, and it's a healthy thing that churches need to work toward, that they have solid relationships with other churches who are faithful. Might they do some things differently? Sure. But we're both faithful, we're both committed, and there needs to be a closeness that exists. And that's one of the things that we're seeing. So he finds them walking in truth, and he says, and now I ask you, dear lady, not as I were writing to you a new commandment, but one that we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. Keep doing that. And what I love about John is, when you're younger and you hear a person say something and they repeat it over and over again, at a certain point you start to kind of roll your eyes at it, right? When you're younger, you start to kind of roll your eyes at it. You're like, yeah, I know. Listen, if what you're saying is an important truth, annoy the snot out of them to where they cannot escape that truth no matter what happens. There are certain phrases that are important. I think about one that I've heard my dad say a zillion times. He would say it in sermons. He'd say it at home. He'd say it everywhere. He would always say to us, Jesus said, you shall know. Jesus did not say, you will know the truths, plural, and the truths will set you free. He said, you will know the truth, singular, and the truth, that truth, will set you free. Continually driving into our minds that truth exists, and it doesn't exist in multiple forms. Truth exists, and your job is to pursue truth at all times. Or things like, if you play with a skunk long enough, you're going to smell like one. So what I find interesting is people, we read 1 John, we read 2 John, we read 3 John, and John keeps saying love one another, and we're like, okay. Yeah. And what he was doing is working. What would John say? If John could be teleported right back here tonight and say, John, you can say anything you'd want, anything you want to say. No doubt in my mind, he'd say this: love one another. That's it. It's like when Churchill was asked to speak to a graduation, we need something deep and profound. he gets up, and this is his whole speech. Never give up. And he sat down. But that's the message. And so it's interesting to see how John keeps coming back to that and saying that that's something that needs to be continually impressed upon our minds. And then he goes on, as he did in the first letter, to say, and this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. That is, that's how we demonstrate our love. We keep his commandments, which involves loving others, and we've been through the circular type thought. This is the commandment just as you have heard from the beginning, and you should walk in it. Okay, so continue to love one another. Then he moves to the exhortation of things, and he says, for many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Such a one is the deceiver and the antichrist. You can look at 1 John 4, 2 and 3, 1 John 2, 22. We've dealt with these issues at length, and so we won't rehash them. So he says this, because the deceivers are out there, verse 8, watch yourselves so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but may win a full reward. Okay? So, same thing he's been saying. They are deceivers. They're liars. They can lead you away. They can pull you away from Jesus. Okay? And so it's something to beware of, especially this group which is saying Jesus is not who God said he was. And that's just, I mean, like we've said before, you take this away, Christianity doesn't exist. It doesn't make any sense. And so he is very concerned about this. And so he says, look, more practically speaking, see that you do not lose what you have worked for. Don't be deceived by the people of verse 7. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Okay? So everyone who goes on ahead, so it's, here's Jesus and we just keep walking. All right? And as we just keep walking, where is Jesus? We've left him behind. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Jesus. So here's this circle of where Jesus is. We get in there and then we decide, no, I'm going to keep going. Well, you've left him behind. So whoever goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. That is, listen, how has John used this over and over in 1 John and in his gospel? To have God abiding in us and you in God. You're in a relationship with him, like you're faithful to him. If you leave Jesus, you don't have God. Now, the phrase, whoever abides in the teaching of Christ. So what does the phrase mean? So when you look at it, the first thing we have to do is simply begin with possibilities. So I'm going to bore you for just a second. In Greek, this is written in what is called a genitive. And a genitive, well, it's kind of a bait and switch, because when you're learning elementary Greek, the genitive always talks about possession. And then you get to like Greek 3, and then they hand you this big, thick book, and it's like, actually, there are like more like 64 different ways the genitive is used, and it is rarely used in possessive, and you just take that book and you throw it at the screen or the teacher, because this is going to be the biggest nightmare of your life, is trying to figure out how this is used. Okay, this phrase, the doctrine of Christ or teaching of Christ, is a big genitive. And so there are roughly 3 possibilities, though, when you look at it grammatically speaking. One is that the teaching of Christ are the teachings that Christ taught. That's one way it could be interpreted. Another way that it could be interpreted is that it is the teaching about Christ. Okay? And then the third is kind of a middle road between those two things. And sometimes, because this genitive is so confusing, sometimes when we look at text and you can't really make a definitive statement, that's led people to conclude, well, maybe the writer did that on purpose. Maybe God did that on purpose to say it encompasses all of it. And so, in essence, how that would work with this would be like, okay, the first two options, is it the teachings that Jesus gave, or is it the teachings about Jesus? And this view would say, well, it's both of them. It's ambiguous on purpose to tell you that it encompasses all of them. Contextually speaking, in my mind, and everybody is free to form their own opinion, but contextually speaking, what have we been dealing with? What have they been corrupting? Is it the teachings that Jesus gave? Or was it teachings about who Jesus is? To me, it's about teachings about who Jesus is, right? He didn't come in the flesh. That's not a teaching that Jesus, went out and, we don't have a saying where Jesus is coming out saying, I've come in the flesh. Now, that's a universally accepted teaching, and it's a teaching about Jesus. And it's already been mentioned in the flow of this context in verse 7. That's what he said. Many deceivers who've gone out into the world who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. So, the best I can understand it, the best I can wrestle with it is, and listen, there are plenty of people who strongly feel that this speaks about the teachings that Jesus gave, and that's fine and good. Contextually, though, for me, I can't get to that point. I'm not, and a lot of people, when they hear you say something like that, they hear you saying things you're not actually saying. Okay? Well, you mean it doesn't matter what? No. Because a lot of times this text is used to talk about certain lines of fellowship with people. And I agree, it addresses certain lines of fellowship, but the line of fellowship under discussion is, what do you think about Jesus? When they received the letter, it wasn't because people were going around saying, Jesus taught this and he was wrong. It's because people were going around and saying, Jesus is not who we've been taught he was. And so, directly speaking, that contextually, I don't know what else conclusion I can come to. If a person leaves, if you deny the divinity of Jesus, Christianity falls apart anyway. I mean, in my mind, in my judgment, this is a case of, that's been a big question, has always been lines of fellowship, where those lines are, how do you draw them, how do you do all those things, and I will tell you, it's not as plain as some people have wanted to make it. Okay? Because the Bible doesn't have... Listen, you know how many times I've sat at my desk and wished God would have just handed a sticky note on the back of Revelation that said, hey, here's the list, by the way, if anybody goes beyond this? No. I've wished everything that had happened. And I know there are lines that have to be drawn. But we sometimes have an expression where we say, okay, that your understanding and your teaching is correct, but you're citing a verse that's not saying what you're saying. And so we call it right teaching, wrong passage. Okay? And so, contextually, I think that's what's going on. And do lines have to be drawn? Yes. Does this statement give us the principle that certain lines have to be drawn and there are certain doctrines that cannot be tampered with? Yes. If this verse is not teaching that there are fellowship lines, I don't know what in the world it would be saying. But what I am saying is the fellowship line that's directly under discussion here is, do you think Jesus is the Son of God or not? Do you believe Jesus is the Son of God or not? Now, how far that line is extended through applications, that's a whole different discussion. So, I don't really want to get into 10 and 11 because that will require some background. Of how do we then handle these situations? I will say, with the last 2 or 3 minutes, that, and I think I mentioned it last week, that if we read this with modern American ideas, we're going to get to some conclusions that are not good. Like, for an example, I've heard people say, well, you can't invite a Jehovah's Witness into your house and study with them. They don't believe Jesus is God. You can't invite them into your house or bid them Godspeed. You can't give them water. You know, if they're, one of my friends from preaching school has preached in Klamath Falls, Oregon since we graduated. That's where he was from. And it's a huge Mormon population, massive. Multiple, like 2,000 to 3,000 member, I think they're called stakes is what they call them. And we went into one when we were there a few years ago and talked with a group of people. And, and as a matter of fact, Neil has done such a good job that when the local missionaries have had such a hard day of people being unkind to them, they will come to Neil's house because they know they have someone who at least kindly engage them in a discussion. But that's a conclusion that's just not. That's not what we need to be asking ourselves is, how would they have understood inviting somebody into your house? How did they understand that? And a lot of this gets into Mediterranean culture. And in Mediterranean culture, you're very suspicious because of this thing that we've mentioned before. And it's called the evil eye. The belief that evil is transferred through body openings. So your ears, your eyes, your nose, your mouth. And people can bring this evil with them. That's why you have the, what is that called? It's the eye. What's that called? Brooke bought one in the Bahamas this last year. It was the evil eye. And, but basically, like, why do we wear bracelets and rings and stuff? Like, why? If you were to follow that, if you were to trace the origin of like bracelets and rings and earrings and all this kind of stuff, if you were to trace that, and I mean really trace it, you would find that we wear shiny things because that causes people to, if an evil person looks, they might catch the glimmer of the shiny thing, and the evil that they're trying to transfer to me will bounce off. And it won't come into my eyes because that's an opening where evil can enter me. People say, this sounds strange. People still believe this all over the world. They still believe it all over the world. Now, if you believe that and a stranger comes into your city, the whole city is going to stand back from a stranger. You see why evangelism was so difficult for Paul? What is this guy doing? But what if somebody in the community says, hey, he's with me? So you see, like inviting somebody into your home is more like validation to tell the community you're safe, you're good. That's very different than inviting somebody into your house to say, yeah, let's study the Bible together. And so these are the things we have to keep in mind. But we will look at that a little bit more as we come back and then into 3 John beyond that.